Have you always wanted to learn how to make a quilt? This is a great tutorial for a simple, beginner-friendly quilt. I'll help you every step of the way. So this is going to be part one of piecing the Hello Baby quilt that is beginner-friendly and perfect for that little baby that's going to either in your life or going to be in your life soon. The first part will cover piecing and fabric selection, and the second part will cover the French pillowcase binding technique, as well as our simple, beginner-friendly, forgiving wave stitching pattern. So I hope you'll join me. So let's talk about the materials and the tools you're going to need to make your quilt. So the first thing I would suggest is that you print out the pattern. And this is a digital download, and you'll find the link in the description below. So print that out, and that's the first thing to get going. Then let's look at fabrics. Quilting cotton is available in 42 to 44 inch widths. It's typically 100% cotton and is the perfect choice for this project. There will be four different kinds of, I guess 4 categories is the way to think about it, of fabrics that you'll need for this quilt. And you can choose how simple you want to make it and how complex you want to make it, but I'll tell you what I'm doing. For the background of the quilt, the navy part in this illustration, I'm using this fabric. And then I decided that what I wanted to do for the pieced section that we'll be working on is to create stripes with a lighter blue fabric and black and white fabrics. And the black and white that I've chosen in the blue is here. So when you're looking to buy fabric in a quilt shop or online, it's very helpful to look at the combinations and see how they're going to look from a distance, because you want to make sure that there's enough contrast. So I held all of these up 10 feet away and saw that there was really good contrast. So mine should be very easy to see. Then the last thing you'll need in terms of fabric is a backing fabric. And I've chosen this fabric that looks very nice with all of the other fabrics for my backing. So because baby quilts in particular, unlike wall hangings or maybe bed quilts, they're pretty much two-sided quilts. You see both quilts a lot when it's in a stroller, a car seat, or whatever. So the backing it's critical to have a nice backing for a baby quilt. But if you have scraps and you want to piece the back, you can do that too. So that's what we need in terms of fabric. Now let's look at the other items that we'll need. We'll need thread, and it's important to use 100% cotton thread. A lot of the thread that you may see in fabric shops or sewing centers maybe a polyester or a cotton covered polyester. We like to use 100% cotton because polyester melts at a lower temperature. So when you're ironing cotton, you want the thread and the fabric that you're using to be the same fiber mix. So when you iron, you don't have one melting and one not hot enough to be able to get the wrinkles out. So if you're making a polyester blouse or something, polyester thread is great. But when you're using quilting cotton, you really want to be using a cotton thread with it. So be sure to look for the fiber content on that. You will need some kind of scissors to trim threads, and we're going to be cutting through with a rotary cutter for the fabric. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can do the same thing with scissors. And a rotary cutter is typically used with a cutting mat as well as some kind of ruler. So this is one of our rulers, and it has a no skid surface on the back, and it's helpful for cutting on a mat. But again, if you want to, you can do the whole thing with scissors as well. You're also going to need some pins. I like the flower head pins because I find them very easy to grab. We have ours on a magnetic pin cushion, which is very helpful when you're sewing. You'll also want a seam ripper. seam rippers are, there's so many out there. This is not the most glamorous, but to me, it is the one that fits in my hand the best. It's the one for 30 years I've grabbed. As soon as I need a seam ripper, the Clover version it's just my favorite. And we sell this on our website, but this is, if you're gonna buy one seam ripper, this is the one. You're also gonna need some kind of marking tool. I like the Clover chalk. It's a little tiny wheel, and you can write numbers on it or you can chalk lines on it. This is a great tool. There are also chalk pencils, or even school board chalk is fine. You just want to make sure that you'll be able to see it on the fabric and that it doesn't have a lot of pigment in it. You don't want to use colored chalk because sometimes that pigment becomes hard to wash out. You're also going to need an iron. If possible, with a really good steam function. We like this Rowenta Focus iron a lot because it's got tremendous steam and it makes the fabrics lie very flat, which makes them easier to sew. You're also going to need a piece of batting that's just a little bit bigger than the finished quilt, which is 30 inches by 40 inches. So maybe at least 32 by 42, just to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. But it's important to think about the type of fiber that you want to use for your batting. They perform a little bit differently, and they have different pluses and minuses. We're going to use 100% cotton. This is kind of a mid-weight in terms of the loft or the thickness of the batting. You can also get battings that are cotton polyester blends, wool blends, bamboo and silk blends. There's a variety of fibers that are available, and some of them perform differently. I would encourage you to make sure that you get something that is machine washable and machine dryable. The cotton and the wool tend to shrink a little bit, which is provides a nice texture for the finished quilt. But you want to make sure that when you're looking for batting, that you ask or you read if you're buying it online, how far apart the quilting stitches need to be in order to have the batting remain stable. We like Quilter's Dream battings. They're the only ones that we've used for over 20 years. Again, we have no relationship with them other than that we just like their products. So we'll put links below and on our resources page of Modern Quilt Studio for you to be able to see the types of batting that are available from Quilter's Dream. Another item that is listed as an optional supply on the supply list is Oda 505. For the French pillowcase binding technique that we will be using, this is a helpful thing to have. It's not critical, but it makes it a little bit smoother if you want to give it a try. And this can be purchased at online or at sewing supply stores. It's important before we start cutting, you pre-wash and pre-shrink all of the fabrics you'll be using. You don't need to pre-shrink the batting. However, the fabrics, you want to make sure that you've gotten any fugitive dyes out off of them and make sure that they are shrunk as much as they're going to shrink. Now, we've prepared a really thorough video on how to prepare fabrics and pre-wash them before you start sewing. So feel free to go ahead and watch that and get everything all prepared. So after you pull the fabric out of the dryer, you'll want to press it really well, and then you're ready to start cutting. Let's talk about cutting the fabric. There are various strategies to cutting fabric that make it easier, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable with the cutting, because sometimes if you're nervous about it, that's when you can cut yourself, and I don't want that to happen. But the main thing to think about is that, especially when you have big pieces of fabric, like the sections of the navy blue that we're going to be cutting right now, if you think about the size of the pieces, there's one that's 30 and a half by 18 and a half. That's the top part. of the quilt. The bottom part is the same width, right? 30 and a half, and it's 8 and a half. But I find it easier to cut one big piece and then trim off the bottom part as opposed to cutting them separately. That way you make sure that they're both the same width. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a million different ways to cut fabric, and I'm going to show you the method that works best for me. However, I always tell students, the method that gets you what you want is the method for you. And if it's a different method from what I'm using, totally fine. You do what works for you. But this is the way that I find it easiest to cut. Now, for big pieces, if you think about a 30 and a half by 18 and a half piece, that is a big piece if you were to cut it with the fabric open. And because cutting mats typically are about 24 inches deep, we find it a little easier to cut the fabric when it's folded in half. So you'll see that what I've done here is I've put the selvages together and smoothed it out to make sure we can get the grain, everything's flat. And I've aligned the folded edge here, so you can see that this is folded right sides out, and you can see that the folded edge is right at the 0 on my cutting mat. Now you'll notice here on the edge, let's see if I can point this out, that there's the gap, there's a little bit of a gap. And sometimes when you are cutting, or somebody at the shop or wherever you got your fabric, sometimes the way that the fabric is rolled onto the bolt might mean that the cut isn't totally straight. But this, when you have a very clean fold here, that's when you know you're folding on the grain. And so we're just going to trim this off. But this is the amount of fraying that you should expect when you are pulling your fabric out of the dryer. Sometimes there will be, like I can see a little like kind of roping of fraying right there. And don't give that any worry, that's going to come right off. I guess I should also just kind of give you a heads up here that I'm kind of ambidextrous, so I use the cutting tool in both hands, and don't let that freak you out. It's just a little bit easier sometimes to switch back and forth. Before you start cutting with the rotary cutter, the only thing I'll just absolutely be adamant about is that you close the blade before it leaves your hand. These blades are extremely sharp, and I've known many people who have forgotten to close it and have had to make a trip to the ER, which is not where you want to be right now. So be sure to close that blade before you put it down. So let's start with just the basic trim. So the first thing you're going to do is align your ruler to the 0 here, and to make sure at the top and bottom that you're square here. The whole ruler, rotary cutter, mat system is really great for making sure that everything stays square. So the first thing we're going to do is to trim off this little bit of frayed yardage that, so we're on grain and everything is straight and clean there. Now to get our 30 and a half by 27 inch piece, there are a couple of ways we could do it. Because the fabric is 42 inches in this direction, it conserves more fabric to do the 27 in this direction, even though you could, in theory, do it either direction. Quilters always like to save their fabric and preserve as much of it as they can for the next project. So doing a 27 inch cut now is how I'm going to do it. So let me do that 27 inch cut. And again, we'll trim off those selvages as soon as I get this done. So there's your 27 inches. And we're going to take this piece and fold it up. I find it easier, so I don't get mixed up, to be able to fold it into a small piece and set it aside, because sometimes it's easy to get confused about which piece is which when you're working on a quilt. So we're going to cut this 42 by 27 inch piece to a 30 and a half by 27 inch piece. And here's how we're going to do that. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is that you open it up and then fold it in the other direction. Makes it a little bit easier to trim off the selvages. And we're going to do something pretty similar to the way we did it before, because now we know that this is right. Now we're going to cut in the other direction. And as I said, there's lots of different ways to do this. You're going to want to make sure that these raw edges line up to make sure everything is straight and square. Okay, that looks like it's good to me. So now we're going to repeat the same type of cutting that we just did, but instead of the 27, now we're going to do the 30 and a half. So I'm going to line up the selvages right on this 0 line right here. Now, one of the reasons you want to cut off the selvage is that it can skew the fabric. And so even though there are some people who collect actually selvages and make things with them. So if that's of interest, you could do that. But basically you want to make sure that the fabric is going to lie really flat. So let's remove those selvages. Okay, and now we're going to do the 30 and a half measurement. So let me go down here. So again, this is the piece that we don't need, so I'm going to put that with the other piece. So many times I've made mistakes where I've gotten confused, so I find in just kind of keeping the pieces separate from the yardage is really critical. So now you have your 27 by 30 and a half inch piece. Now we're going to go back to the original fold. So let's go back to the 27 inch piece because we're going to cut off that 8.5 inch bottom piece. So we're going to line up those raw edges. And again, there are lots of different ways to do this, but I find it easier to start with a smaller piece when doing the big cutting. Okay, so now there's the 27 inches, and we're going to cut off the 8.5 inch piece at the bottom. I actually find it easier to bring the end down here if I know that I want to cut 8.5 inches off the bottom. I align the fabric on the 8.5 inch mark and then just cut at the 0. And that way I don't have to do any calculations in my head of if it just makes it a little bit more foolproof for me. So I'm going to cut 8.5 off of that. And then we have the 2 pieces of navy that we need for the background. And that's all good to go. Sometimes I think we got a little nick in our blade or something there. Anyway, we're all good. So let's move on to the strips that we're going to need for the blue background for the bars. So we've cut our blue background piece already, and you can check the pattern diagram for how to cut the blue strips. They're very straightforward, and they're going to be, let's see, they're going to be 7 strips that are 2 inches by 14.5 inches. And so that's what I've got here. Okay, so they're ready to go. And now let's talk about the black and white fabrics, because you have a lot of choices here, and it's good to think about how you want to do things. So this is an improvisationally pieced quilt, and that's a term that refers to a type of quilt where you get to make decisions as you go. And one of the reasons that we decided that this would be the perfect quilt for beginners is that it gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to fix mistakes if you make some. So it's very forgiving in that sense. So what we've had you do is to cut a number of fabrics 3 3/4 inches wide of varying lengths. And this is where we're going with this. And this is what the strips are going to look like once they're pieced. So you'll have strips that are made up of as many or as few fabrics as you want. You certainly could, if you wanted to simplify the pattern, instead of piecing these strips from a variety of fabrics, they could all just be one fabric. But again, we're trying to stimulate the brain of the baby here. So having a lot of different black and white fabrics is really great for stimulating that brain development and eyesight and all of that. So we thought it would be fun to have a lot of black and white fabrics for that. So, but here, I'll show you how this is going to work. You're going to have these different lengths, and you can trim them as you wish. And you can see how these are going to come together. Let me show you some of the ones that I've already gotten done here. And each one can be different. And you can tell I need to trim this one down a little bit more. But you're going to decide how many fabrics you want, how long each piece is, and then you just trim it up at the end to make sure it's 14.5 inches long, and then you're good to go. So if you make a mistake, all you have to do is cut it wherever you want to, and then just sew another piece on, and as long as you get to 14.5 inches, you're good to go. So let's show you how to start sewing some of these pieces together. So let's say I'm going to put this fabric with this fabric and this fabric with this fabric. So the first thing we'll do is grab a pin, and we always sew with right sides together. So we're going to put a pin right here to remind us that we're sewing these two together at this end. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing with this one. We'll get one pin here. Now you can sew one strip at a time if you want. I find it a little bit easier to be able to sew several strips at one time. It's also a lot faster. But if you get flustered easily or it just seems like too much, you can just do one at a time. That's easy. So now I'm going to go over to the sewing machine, and I have these 3 strips I'm going to sew together. And then after I do that, I can just keep trimming them down, or I can find other small pieces to add to the other end. There's lots of different ways to do it. So let's get sewing. So the first thing you're going to want to do is familiarize yourself with your sewing machine. If this is a new sewing machine for you, you'll want to read through the manual and understand how to move the needle position, for example, and how to load the bobbin and how to clean the sewing machine between bobbins and that sort of thing. We actually have a YouTube tutorial on how to clean your sewing machine between bobbin changes that you'll find useful for any type of machine. But every machine is a little bit different, so this is a great time to grab some scraps that left over from cutting and practice sewing 1/4 inch away from the raw edge, because that's going to make a huge difference in your ability to sew the quilt and have everything line up in a very satisfying way. So check your seam allowance. Every sewing machine has a plate that has the numbers of how far the seam allowance is from the main needle position. You'll have to check yours and make sure that you're 1/4 inch. We have a foot on ours that guides us in terms of the 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that's a possibility. There are also magnets that you can put on there to make sure that you always, you don't slide over and have too much of a seam allowance. But you'll want to practice before you get piecing your quilt to make sure that that seam allowance is consistent. Now I've brought over the strips that I showed you before at the cutting table. Now let's talk about pinning really briefly. Pinning is, if you're nervous, you can keep the pin in until you start, the needle gets close to the pin. Please don't ever sew over pins, however, as we've had experiences where the pin has broken or the needle has broken because it's hit the pin and it's flown up in our faces. So you really don't want to be ever sewing over pins. But let's get started sewing. Now you'll notice here that I've got a little scrap under my needle, and that is a nice little hack that is useful for not getting thread jams. Many sewing machine repair technicians will tell you that it's when you start and stop right after you've cut the thread that you get jams. So if you can just continue to sew and cut between pieces with a thread, that's a lot easier. Let me show you what I mean. So we're just gonna push the foot pedal, and right there you can see that the presser foot right here, I can lift that up and the thread is still in place. It has not been cut yet, but you can just lift it up and put your pieces that you want to sew under there and start sewing. Now here's the fun part. Let's say we're ready for our next strip. We don't need to cut the thread yet. We can just keep sewing, and you'll see what will happen. This is called chain piecing or leapfrogging, is you'll get a little chain right there and you can cut it at that point. And then you have fewer instances of thread jams. So I'm just gonna, you don't even have to lift up the presser foot. I'm just gonna keep accelerating with the foot pedal. Now I'm getting close to hitting my pin, so I'm gonna take it out now. At this point, the presser foot is providing tension, so the fabric is gonna stay in place. And then when we get to the end of that one, we can get our next piece ready. But at this point, we can go ahead and cut that chain and start assembling a pile of pieces that we will be pressing next. So as many or as few as you want. And let me just get this last one, and then we'll show you how to press. So pressing seams is very controversial in the quilting world. And we think that the standards of pressing to the dark side of the fabric, so in this particular case, most people would press to this direction. And I'll show you what that's going to look like. They would just take an iron and press in that direction. But as you can see, what will happen is you will end up with three layers of fabric on one side of the seam, and then one layer on the other. And this is not desirable from a wear perspective, because especially with a baby quilt that's going to be washed hundreds of times, what's going to happen is that there's going to be more bulk on this side of the seam than on this side of the seam. We think that this standard of pressing developed when people were hand stitching, because they were worried about batting coming out when the stitches were bigger. With our modern day sewing machines, and modern day batting, that's really not a concern anymore. So we've decided that we prefer to press our seams open like this. Now, if you are doing your entire quilt sewn by hand, please press to the side, because the stitches are going to be longer and it's going to be a little less stable. However, I'll show you how we typically press, so we get more even wear, and the quilt is a little bit easier, is to press open. Now we're using the cotton setting with steam if you want, but be careful to move your fingers away or you can get burned. The tip of the iron is really helpful in pressing seams open. And you'll find that especially as you make different kinds of quilts, this method of pressing makes it much easier to assemble more complicated quilting patterns. So now you've got a nicely pressed piece and you're ready to keep going. So at this point, you can either sew on a smaller piece or trim, or just keep going until you get to that 14.5 inches, and then keep going until you've got all 6 done. So now that we've got all of our strips sewn, this is the time to just double check to make sure everything is the right length and the right width. And you can see right here, there's a little bit of a miscut. Do you see how it's a little bit wider on that one piece? So that's really easy to fix. All you have to do is put your ruler down and just trim off, align it with the rest of the strip and just trim off that edge. And now we're going to do the same thing with the length. So you can see that the piece is 16 inches and we need it to be 14.5. So now you can just sort of decide, do you want to trim off this end or do you want to trim off this end? And I really like the cow fabric, so I think I'm going to just trim this little bit off the end. And we'll take that to 14.5. And then we're ready to go. So at this point, what you want to do is lay out your strips in the order that you want them to appear in the quilt. So for example, I might decide that I'm going to lay them out like this. But when you look at it, do you see how there are 3 fabrics in similar places in all on the left-hand side of the quilt? It's not a desirable layout. So then you might fiddle around with it a little bit and say, well, how about if we put this one over here? Oh, well, maybe that's a little too close. How about if we put that there? And maybe we turn this down here. Or actually, maybe this one doesn't have that white labyrinth fabric, so we'll put it there. Oh, that's looking a little bit better now. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. So what you want to do when you're looking at this layout before you start sewing the pieces together is you want to make sure that there isn't a repetition of fabrics side by side, or that maybe all of the fabrics have the same, all of the strips have the same fabric at the bottom or something like that. You want to look around and let's just look at how this is going to look when we start sewing it together. So each of these strips will have a blue strip between it, and we'll lose a little bit in the seam allowance, but you can start seeing how they're going to look together and how it transforms it once you get that color in there with the black and white. So once we get all of this laid out and we're happy with the layout, then we're going to start numbering them before we take them over to the sewing machine. Now it's really easy when you have a lot of pieces or strips like this to get confused because you've done this great job laying it out, but then you got to transport it over to the sewing machine and to the iron, and you don't want to lose your layout there. So, and then there's also one other reason to mark the strips at this point, and that's because we're going to change the direction that we sew. So this is where we get our little marking tool, and I will put a 1 on that one, and I like to put it in the upper left-hand corner of the strip because if you put it in the middle, 6s can become 9s and that can get confusing. And then I'll put a 2 here. And this guy's a little bit harder with numbers, but you can still read it. And we'll do a 3 in the black area and a 4 This may be a little hard to see on camera, but you'll be able to see in a way that works for you. Maybe I'll do this one down here. And I'll do my 6 up here. Okay, so just so you understand where we're going with this, what we're going to do is sew each of these in pairs, and then there's going to be 1 strip left over since we have 6 black and white strips and 7 blue strips. Now, we're going to start, when we sew these pairs together, we're going to start at the top when we're sewing the pairs. However, once we start sewing this pair to this pair, we're going to sew from the other direction. And the reason that is because sometimes with strips, the mechanics of sewing machines are such that sometimes they will stretch the fabric in one direction. So if we sewed all of the strips in one direction, in the same direction, sewing from here to here, here to here, all of the seams, sometimes you'll find that it will bow a little bit and it will warp a little bit to one direction. And this is a technique that we've developed to offset that issue. So we'll sew the first seam in this direction and then in this direction. But when we go to sew these 2 pairs, we'll sew from the other direction. And that offsets the warping that sometimes happens with long strips. So meet me over at the sewing machine. Now that you've got all of your strips sewn, now remember we marked at the top, and we're going to sew from the top the pieced black and white strips to the blue strips. And you're going to sew all in the same direction for this time around, and then we'll reverse it for the next round of sewing. So you're going to sew. You can leave your pins in if it's easier for you. I find it a little bit easier to take them out. But again, it's a personal preference. So we're going to start sewing these. And you can just adjust as needed. And again, when you get to the end of the first strip, you can just take the next strip and put it underneath and keep going. So once you have sewn your black and white strip to your blue strip, it's important to press it. Again, we press our seams open. You do what works for you. We find this method a little bit easier and better for the wear, but if you prefer to press to the side, feel free to do it that way as well. So this is what it looks like on the back when you press it open. So now we're going to assemble the rows, or the pairs, I guess, into the larger pieced unit that goes in the center of the quilt. Now, as I mentioned before, when you are sewing in one direction over and over and over again across a quilt, sometimes you develop warping. So we developed this method of remembering to alternate the directions of sewing so you don't have that problem. It kind of offsets it. So I've chalked right here just to illustrate the point that when we were sewing this piece to this piece, we were sewing in this direction. All of our numbers, they're a little hard to see on camera, but the numbers are at the top of the quilt. And then we sewed each of these seams with the blue piece on the left. We sewed in this direction. And now we're going to sew in the opposite direction to sew this piece to this piece, and this piece to this piece, and so on. So I find it easiest when I'm trying to remember directions of sew, to put a pin at the top of the direction, like the top of where I'm going to start, because once you turn these pieces over, it's easy to get lost as to where you are. Now, we only worry about this direction of sewing when they're long strips. And the longer it is, the more of an issue it is. If you're doing squares or something like that, it's not as much of an issue. So I've got the pins at the top, and this is row number 1 and row number 2. So I'm going to put them together like that. And again, put a pin at the top to remind me that that's where I'm going to start sewing. So I've pinned the top, and I'm also going to put a pin at the bottom just to anchor it. Now let's get sewing. So is your piece all done? So this is what mine looks like. And one of the things that's really helpful when you're making quilts is to measure before you move on to the next step to make sure the piece is the size it's supposed to be. Because sometimes things get a little smaller or a little larger while you're sewing. And then if you want to trim it down, this is the best time to do it. So I measured mine, and mine is exactly 30 and a half by 14 and a half. So I am ready to go and add the top and bottom to the quilt, and then that will complete the piecing part of this project. So as we were sewing these smaller pieces together, I said it wasn't that critical that you pin because the pieces are pretty small. They're not really going too far usually. However, if you have a piece that's this wide, that's 30 inches or 38 and a half inches, this is when you really do want to pin. So I'm going to take the bottom section of the quilt like this. Oh, you know what? I got it wrong side up. Now I just realized. Okay, so now we're in good shape. So, and again, don't worry about the chalk that I chalked on there. That's going to come out in the wash, but probably it'll work its way out as we quilt too. So, but white chalk always works fine. So what we're going to do to attach the bottom is to start in one corner, and we're going to pin the one end. And then we're going to go and pin the other end. Now you might ask, well, why not just pin all the way along here? And what we found out is sometimes things stretch if you do it that way. Whereas if you anchor the corners before you get going, then you're more easily able to distribute any discrepancies between the two pieces. So if you pull those together and then stretch, then you go to the middle. And we're just pinning, we're aligning those two raw edges. And at this point, we're not worrying about any sewing directions or anything like that because we took care of that and everything is all nice and square. So pin as many or as few pins as you need. You definitely want at least 3 on this bottom. Some people really like to pin a lot and they like to have it every 2 inches or something, but you know, you do what works for you. Okay, and let's do the top as well. And with the fabric I've chosen, there isn't a top or bottom, so it doesn't really matter, but you might want to check if you have a directional fabric to make sure that the birds aren't upside down or whatever. So we're going to start in this corner. Oh, and I'll show you what it looks like on the back too. So you can see all the pressed seams. It's very nice and flat. Steam is such a good friend to quilters. It makes everything look so nice and clean and neat. So we always like to give things a good steam press. Okay, now we're going to straighten this out. So many different ways to make quilts. So many different techniques and preferences, and we always really try to focus on what works for you. So if you don't like the pinning or pressing to the to open, pressing seams open, Feel free to press to the side, whatever works for you. Okay, so now I'm going to sew these 2 seams and press, and then we're ready to go and move on to the quilting step. Hey, look at this. I love it. So next step is to quilt it. So be sure to cut your backing and your batting according to the instructions, and we'll get going on that.